Thanks everyone. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. It's like Clem was saying, my name is Dr. Michael Mossman. I'm an academic at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, and I am a colleague of Philip's. He's the university librarian, and we had an interaction about a month ago at a university-wide strategy retreat, they call it, and I met Philip there, and he mentioned this gathering here today for the committee, and then this lecture that was on this topic about indigeneity, storytelling and imagination, embracing indigeneity in architecture, and transforming difficult library buildings. I just thought that was a really interesting topic, and I just reached out to Philip, asked him, maybe there's an opportunity to come over here and present something, because it's very much a big part of the expertise that I possess as an academic in architecture, in the university setting, educating the next generations of architects about storytelling and how it can enhance the project and the way that it lives. And it was a really interesting sort of dialogue to then say, well, there was Fade, who was supposed to be presenting here first. I'm a colleague of his, so it was a very sort of interesting dynamic that could take place. I'm a big fan of his, and it's a shame that he's not present to present his work. So it means that I have potentially up to an hour and a half to talk, rather than 45 minutes, which actually works out quite well, because I can actually talk about project work for a long time, and as it turned out, we were kind of rushing through to make it within the 45 minutes, and this is good in a way. So I'm really happy to be able to spend a bit more time on it. We may not make it up to the full 1.5 hours, but you never know. So yeah, what this presentation that I'm giving today, and James will join us shortly, like Clem said, at 6 a.m. in Sydney, and he is an early riser, so he's keen to participate, but it's 45 minutes earlier than what we had originally planned. So we are going to be talking about a collaboration that we worked on in 2018 for a project that's been recently opened called the Hilltops Young High School Library. And it's a really special project that I was wanting to share with you today. And what we're going to do is present context around what it means about what storytelling and imagination means in the context of architecture, and in relation to indigeneity in architecture. That's a very recent conversation in architecture in Australia. So we're talking about the last 5 years, where it's really started to, the profession has evolved to incorporate more about Indigenous cultures of Australia. And there are plenty of cultures, Indigenous cultures in Australia. We had the great privilege last night to go to the Polynesian Cultural Centre and see this amazing performance and get to understand the sort of multitude of cultures across the Pacific, across Polynesia, that have all these stories to tell, and that certainly resonates from an Aboriginal point of view, in how there are histories, there are dark histories that are present and still with us, and how those stories can be told, or are told, and now how they can be told through architecture. And this library is an example of where we've had a go at that. And we like to think that we were, as a collaboration, doing something very innovative, and as the presentation continues, we'll start to unpack what those innovations were. So James will be joining us. I was originally presenting this with a principal architect of the group named Hayball, and they are specialists in education architecture. And the principal, Kit Koo, who Clem mentioned, she was unavailable today due to illness. So James has stepped in kindly, and he was also involved in the project. But I already had an existing relationship with the architect Kit. We used to work together. We have a history of working together in practice, and I had gotten to know her, and then we went our separate ways. I went into academia, and she went into this other practice. And then after a few years, we actually came back together for this project. She sort of reached out to me and asked if I was interested to work as a consultant to facilitate conversations about the Indigenous narratives of this place where this library is located. And it was really good fortune that I was able to re-establish that connection with her, and then establish a new connection with James, and to sort of facilitate a process that was about really looking into indigeneity in this project. So it was a really exciting proposition, and one that was sort of built off very much on a process of how to actually talk and create a dialogue about this local culture and how it can be incorporated into the architecture. So what that means is, how we always sort of start with this slideshow. Oh, yes. We always start with this process of like Uncle Raymond was saying this morning, a really acknowledging place, and acknowledging country is what we call it in Australia. And this acknowledgement of saying, well, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place, and recognise that the custodianship over many years, and how I'm very thankful to be here, pay respects to elders past and present. And with the library project like this, it's about looking to the past, but also understanding and recognising that there's future generations to come. And that's a really important part of how we sort of situate and locate architecture within this continuum. And so for me, it's about that storytelling, or that acknowledgement is about acknowledging that there's all this storytelling and there's stories that are associated with the place. So it's very particular and distinct. And with that, the storytelling is this process of coming together to form a relationship, to build trust, and to then be able to do business. And the business is part of the ongoing evolution of that relationship. And a quote that I use often, and a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, used it, and I've sort of taken it from her. But she's sort of saw this one, and it says, storytelling must begin with the teller positioning themselves in relation to clan and place. Before embarking on the story, the teller must first describe their journey to the place where the story begins. So it's this nature of, for Aboriginal cultures, and I think for many Indigenous cultures, understanding, your place, or where you come from, what your family history is, what your culture is, what the connectedness to particular territory and landscape or waterscape is the core driver, of who you are. And that's something to look back to the past and be able to know those stories in order to share them with future generations. And for me, it's like how, coming from an Aboriginal background, and my connection is with the tribal group called Kukuyalanji, and that's in far north Queensland. And I have a connection to the country of that place through my grandfather in this particular instance. And that's something that I'll quickly touch on in a moment. But there's this, we use this term in Australia, it's country, so it's borrowed from the English language, but it's really about this creating this connectedness, or understanding that there's place that it has all of this richness, it has all this richness in it. So I look at country and sometimes think about how to define it, and it's always something that's changing, like how you think about it. So this nature of country is a concept to understand and appreciate in Australian, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander context. Country is a realm, it's a universe, it's nature, it's all around us, and constitutive of ways of being, knowing and doing. It's everywhere and always, stories, memories, interactions, expressions, designs and transformations that are influenced by processes of living and thriving. It's the land, the water, the sky, the air, the fire, its place, its location, its self, its community, culture, country, and it's a mix of separate and interconnected beings, and a collaboration of autonomous beings and a collaboration of interconnected living processes in flux. That's very wordy. That was the moment I had, I just felt really creative in that way. But you just think, when you're just living it, that's just, you just always move on the go, and it's there's something that's always present. And it's an exercise as a university educator that we try to impart on students who are coming from other backgrounds, predominantly in Australia. There's many different cultures, but how to really connect with those, with their own cultures is an important sort of starting point that I think is critical to then how you can locate yourself, in relation to a project. And the nature of learning, for me, it's about you are part of that story, of that learning process, so that when you're not separated from it, but you're actually interconnected with it, and then you draw yourself into it, and then that creates the new knowledge that then imparts out into the ether. So that's a sort of background. Kukuyalanji is like rainforest country. Everyone's heard of the Daintree, which is north of Cairns in far north Queensland. It's this really lush environment. This place very much reminds me of that area in far north Queensland. And yeah, there's plenty of stories to tell about it, and how that can impact on the way that I view what architecture means. So architecture is not, is more than, when I went through university, it was about learning only about the Western canons, for instance, so what was happening here in the US and Europe. So there were all these sort of precedents that were the drivers of the education process, but very little, if none. There was no content that related to how people connected to traditional custodians, connected to places that were distinct and very much connected to a very distinct location. So for me, the storytelling is recognising, like I say, about Kukuyalanji, and I'm born and raised in this place, Gimoy, and Gimoy is more commonly known as Cairns in far north Queensland. That's a very big tourist hub for that area. The Great Barrier Reef is present. There's all these hinterlands and beautiful experiences to take in. And the traditional custodians of that place is the Gimoy Wallabara Yidinji people. and that they have that's the very specific areas that are in relation to many other different groups around that place. So that's the important thing, the relations that are present. So a group is not just separate living in a bubble, but always interacting. So this is an aerial photograph of Cairns, of Gimoy, and it was a township that was set up in the late 1800s. It was all about extracting resources from the earth. And this place was the ideal setting for a port for big ships to come in and remove country from where it came from, and then process it to become something else for a colonial benefit. And so it does have this colonial background, and it's this sort of imposition of this infrastructure, this townscape, over what was originally mangrove systems. So it's all mud flats and very particular ecologies. So on the left-hand side, you can see how there's the original untouched ecologies of the mangrove systems, and then in the foreground is this built-up, area where the landscape has been completely changed from what it once was. So that's the sort of context that we, as an Aboriginal architect and academic, that you're framing what's present, with what something once was, and how, with good design, that you can look to those paths in order to then design new realities with, something in mind of how this country wants to be. So that's the sort of nature of what the sort of critical focus of what architecture can do when it starts to interact with indigeneity. So there's stories, and there's the potential as well that's important. So when I was saying that my connection to Kukui LNG is through my grandfather on the right-hand side, and he was, a 5-year-old boy in a place called Mossman, where my name comes from, and he was removed from his mother and then removed to an Aboriginal mission that was based in a place nearby to Cairns called Yarrabah. And he never saw his mother again. And how, we just think how those sorts of histories are part of who I am and part of a lot of people across the Australian continent, and also for Indigenous cultures across the world. And how that can be really traumatic, and the trauma exists in who we are, and then how that actually has a role to play in the practices that we carry out. So, recognise how he met my grandmother in this Anglican run mission, and they had their family. My dad was the youngest, and there's these particular photographs, and they're from a collection called the Tyndale collection, and there was an anthropologist who went around Australia to these missions and took photographs of the people in this sort of way, where it's very raw. The intent is to just capture this image of this person. So there's a interesting narrative around how these photographs are present within archives around different states in Australia that families can access in a sort of very regimented way. But to say that it's a really important part of the story. So my grandmother was removed from a country to this place. Many other people were removed, from areas and relocated to very far away places, to cut disrupt the culture. So it's a very sad story, one that's very present. that when they had their family, they were in Yarrabah, and after many years, my grandfather and grandmother were asking the protector for Aboriginal people in the state of Queensland to get permission to move from this sort of concentrated mission area into the township of Cairns. And the protector is this, government representative who's has this position of power over all Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, in Queensland, in the States. And again, it's this notion of how there's no self-empowerment for a whole community of people, but they were very much under the control of a bureaucracy that didn't really give too much. So they moved into Cairns, and when they went there, they would have encountered buildings such as this one, which is the current Cairns Library, Cairns the City Library. It used to be located elsewhere in a more modern building, and this building was formerly a City Council building. The City Council moved into a new building, and then the library relocated into this one. So there's buildings like this, all through Cairns and these regional areas, and that's part of this, for me, the sort of colonial expansion of, dropping infrastructure onto landscapes, and you can find this type of building here in Honolulu, let alone in every major city and small regional town across Australia. There's architecture of this typology that's built in a certain time period. It's a reference to classical architecture typologies, with all these references to the different ways you communicate architecture, and it's quite daunting, or sort of provides an exclusive quality in terms of for me, it's troublesome going into this building now because it's just like very foreign. The library is great inside. There's a lot of information and books and other media to look at, but just the building itself is very sort of standoffish and presents an issue about how you actually make it more accessible, how the architecture can become more designed to be more accessible for all communities who use the place. Yeah, so we'll make this work. Thanks very much for holding on, everyone. It's and thanks James for joining us. Sydney time, it's early. Much appreciated. I was just giving an extended intro. How, like I was saying, with this infrastructure, it's part of the story of many places across Australia, big cities, small regional towns. The library that we speak to in a moment, there's examples of this architecture in that place, and it's part of the project's stories that we'll go into in a moment. I'm going to continue speaking through sort of framing this talk, and then in a moment I'll hand it over to James. He's going to talk to the specifics of the actual architecture, the project, the library project that is the title of this presentation. What's important as well, like moving on from how looking at these items that I've just raised, and how that holds significance in the context of how I practice architecture is, and the evolution of the profession evolution of the profession in more recent times. And we've seen that there's frameworks and principles that have been designed that are all about how indigeneity and storytelling can become part of a normal process of architecture. And one that for me is very exciting, as I mentioned, was hardly little or no content about Aboriginal culture in architecture, going through university and through a lot of my practice. And then now where there's frameworks such as the Connecting with Country framework in the bottom row there, which is the New South Wales government framework of principles that are designed to really inspire practitioners in the industry to really dive deep into how architecture can incorporate stories of place. Then at the University of Sydney, we've composed a principles document called the Willunga Wingara Design Principles. And that's seen in the university's campuses about how small changes can really make a difference to what it means accessibility and inclusiveness. So there's been a transformation of the way that buildings and new infrastructure has been designed. Current infrastructure, such as the Fisher Library, for instance, where there's just places within that have been designed, for Aboriginal people, students and staff, and to make it more accessible. And also just the landscaping and the placemaking that has really transformed the campus into something that has more belonging to the place, and it's telling a story of that place as well. So there's all these sort of interconnections about these frameworks and principles. And then there's this other item which is called the National Standard of Competency for Architects. And that's the sort of the structural driver of how university architecture programs have to meet accreditation requirements, and also for practitioners to meet continuing professional development as well. And in this standard document, it's about, in 2021 was the first time in its history that there have been performance criteria included that are country and First Nations, cultures and community specific performance criteria. So in curriculum for architecture programs now, it's mandated that there's learning outcomes relating to country and culture that are part of the students' learning outcomes for that degree. And that's across Australia, so it's a big structural change, and it's one that's really exciting, but it also is one that's very much, a lot of people are asking questions about how do we actually do it, and I was talking to the architecture school on Wednesday, and how, if there's actual learnings that are happening, in the school here about curriculum that's designed, to expose students to local cultural practices and placemaking. And that is, this really big shift, and one that's, there's a lot of potential of where that can go into the future as well. So that's, all these things, for me, it's about creating relationships. So the relationships is such a big issue, like I was saying, with these tribal groups, it's always about the relationships that we're with others, with other clan groups. And then within the context of this project, it's about the relationships that are formed with Kit, project architect, and also James, in how then we can create a narrative, based on those relationships. And when that ties in with other sorts of, activities and advocacy work that happens, then it starts to create a pretty interesting dynamic about how the profession continues to evolve. I've been recently awarded an Australian Research Council grant for a 3-year study on that's titled Indigenising the Built Environment in Australia, and it's about how asking these questions to universities with architecture programs and to practitioners in architecture and allied disciplines about how their stories are going in relation to this new standard of competency document with these new criteria that will be provide a rich source of information, for how the profession continues to move into the future. And with this project, I can call upon the experiences that I had with James and Kit and Hayball about the process that was undertaken for this the young high school library, and how that was preceded that 2021 competencies document about a project process that really is more inclusive and provides design processes that are more accessible, and ultimately a finished design that will live in the community for everyone. So it's an interesting process, and one that will, over the next 3 years, I'm hoping to come back to the school here and have conversations with student and staff representatives, and hopefully build up this database of information. The interactions is an important component of, again, meeting someone. That sort of first exercise about storytelling, tell us your story, what's important to who you are, where you come from, what your community is, who your family is, what's fun about you. There's all these things that are really important. So I'm very much a facilitator of how you draw yourself into a project rather than sort of stay separate from it and keep it as a separate entity. And there's project work that I've worked on in the past, where it's about understanding or meeting a new group who's part of a engagement process. There's traditional custodians of the place who have deep time connections to an area. Then there are also people who have historical connections to a place, and they're like how with the many disrupted cultural narratives that are present in Australia, that there are Aboriginal people who are in places that is considered off country, so they're not on their original territory from their ancestry, but they're under the place of another group, but they're still connected. So there's all these different types of connections that groups have, and what what we try to facilitate is how the conversations, or the relationship, leads to conversations about that local culture, and then how that can then be facilitated into the actual design. So there's things like understanding basic things about time within a project. Things take time to, relationships take time to develop, it takes time to develop trust, and how then with that the stories can start to unfold and become more accessible for people to share, local community members. So there's things like in one of the projects there on the middle right, it's a reference to the humpback whale, which we were lucky to get a glimpse of yesterday, but there's narratives up and down the Australian coast about the local communities who had very deep spiritual connections to the humpback whale as it migrated north and then back down south again to the Antarctic waters. And in this case, the project was about incorporating the name, which is Gurua in the local Sydney language, and that then became the name of the building, and then aspects of the features of Gurua were then incorporated into the actual building design to provide this really important presence as the users of this place, every day they're communicating with this presence, and that has significance to how then that building is used into the future. So there are these examples where in project work we've done that, and then for the young project it was this opportunity to then connect to a new community that I hadn't connected with before. There was a case of where James and Kit had previously met with the group before I was brought on board into the team, and it's some really amazing people in the community that were able to, through that relationship building, then tell stories about what was important to them and to the community in a cultural sense. And the place that this library is located is in the Wiradjuri Nation. So Wiradjuri Nation is one of the bigger nation groups in Australia. And you can see with the map there's like many different groupings, and there's sort of all interconnectedness between them. And within the Wiradjuri there are clan groups, and the clan group for the place where the library is located is the Mandatory. And then the actual name of the place is Young. And Young has a history, sort of, this traditional custodian history to it that goes back deep into time and is still present, and there's still futures that lie ahead. And then there are these colonial histories that have stories to tell. And one of the stories is about the original person who arrived into that area and settled there. James White, his name was, had an interaction with a local custodian named Coburn Jackie, and there was a relationship there. And the local Aboriginal community were telling that story as if it was a really important, it was a very important story that is part of this, of the narrative of this place, and then potentially part of this project. And this is an example of the sort of colonial infrastructure. That's like I'm showing you the Cairns Library, where it's this has this very certain type of presence. And again, when you first see it, it's very physically confronting. And that's actually was used by the school as part of its amenities. And then there are also these immigration stories as well. So during those 1800s, there were, again, resources booms in these areas, and the Chinese community came over and settled here and worked, for these resources as well. And with that, there's all these narratives that are interconnected, very much that there's pride in these stories and how they're told, and that there's this component of indigeneity that sort of has a thread that weaves through all of it. And that's really something that's special when you start to dive deep into a project and really unpack, all of these different narratives that you can find connections with. And as I'll hand it over to James in a moment, but it's this case of where those stories can then become, part of the project's narrative, and then actually into the design, and then you see as it becomes part of the finished project. James, I'll hand it over to you now. Might be, I think it's coming through the laptop, but let me just try to test that. Do you want to make a start? We'll see if it works.
Okay, great. Okay, well, nice to be here today. The sun's just rising in Sydney, so apologies if I look a little bit tired. So Hayball is the company that I work for, got involved in this project in about 2017, and our client was Schools Infrastructure New South Wales, who's the government body that's responsible for delivering schools all across New South Wales. And we were engaged at a sort of a feasibility stage to work out, could you have a joint use library, which means, the school, high school, and the local community both sharing the same library, which is a bit of a new idea in New South Wales and hasn't really been done much before. And so we were asked to just have a look at this project and see is it feasible, and start talking to the community. We had a really rich brief from the start, so and Wellbeing Space. So really an amazing brief from the start. And from the start, the project vision was clearly to create this truly joyous youth library, which would support a whole lot, learning in the Hilltops area, which is the name of that region. But it was also clear from the very start that, there was a really rich historical context within this part of New South Wales for some of the reasons that Michael has already started to introduce a second ago. So that's why I've highlighted right there, and that is really why, from very early on, we knew we would need someone like Michael as part of our team on this project, because those things will take a lot of interpreting over time and working out where it all sat in the project. If you go to the next slide, Michael, I don't think I have control of that. So this is just a little bit of sort of context for you. So Sydney and both sort of Young are shown on that map. It's about sort of a 4 to 5 hour drive west of Sydney. Sort of very much a rural farmland, working kind of a regional town. And once more, Michael. You can see it's sort of part of a network, sort of a patchwork of small towns. And if you go one more again, Michael. This is quite important, this slide, because it does show the smaller communities which are around Young. And this library, although it serves the town of Young, it's also very important for the smaller villages around Young. There's a town called Burrawa, a town called Arden, which Young is probably about 15,000 people, Burrawa and Young are probably about 10,000 people each. And there's many smaller villages of less than 1,000, which would also use Young as sort of a central hub in the area. Slide. This is just a quick map of Young, just to give you some sort of bearings of this area. In purple, the bottom left, you can see a large patch which is Young High School, and there's a green patch just to the north of that, which is Carrington Park, and that's where our site is. And the main street of Young is sitting more towards the top of the page, and we just highlight sort of cultural institutions in Young here, which the sort of the libraries, the art galleries. And so there is already, I guess, a bit of a sort of civic precinct already in that part of Young. But it is a change from where the existing council library was, which was up on the main street, which is towards the north of the picture, which, I'll mention in a second, what was one of, I guess, the controversial elements of moving the council library across town. If you go to the next slide, this is zooming in more on the site itself. This is a more recent satellite image where the new building has actually been already built. But if you go to the next slide, you can see how it's sort of broken up here. You've got Young High School on the bottom left. You've got TAFE, which in New South Wales basically means a tertiary technical college where people would go to study a trade. And then Carrington Park on the north, which is a public park open to the community. And really probably one of the only, landscaped, more colonial style park in Young. On the next slide, we are just popping out some things which were very apparent as soon as we got to the site. So there are some elements of heritage items on the site. State government would consider heritage items, but obviously, as Michael mentioned, there's colonial heritage on the site. So there's a courthouse which is on the right, and there's a jail on the left, which were built in the mid-1800s, which have since been started to use for other purposes. The courthouse on the right being the administration block for the school, and the TAFE, the jail on the left, is now used as the administration block for the TAFE building. And the 4 green circles are hoop vines, which were also planted in the 1800s. And on the next slide, you can see this is a map of how this site was originally intended, where you have a large block courthouse, a large block the jail, surrounded by street network, which never got built. So that east-west street, called West Street, I believe it was built for a period of time, then Young took over that street. The north-south street, which was during the centre side, was never built. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see this creates quite a strange interface when you get to the site, because you have these large next slide, it's very apparent also that there was already elements of First Nations culture on the site. There's a reconciliation tree which was planted just outside the bets line near the courthouse, which is the photo on the left. And the high school itself already had what they called their Indigenous garden, which was started and maintained by the high school, and was a very much loved part of the school. And so there was already starting this network of different places on site. We were thinking, how do we start giving all these places meaning and linking together? And the third thread of history, as Michael mentioned, is this history of a race riot, which they didn't know for sure, but they believed that it occurred somewhere in the vicinity of Barrington from historical records, which were known at the time. But no one really knew for sure exactly where this event occurred. And it was in the historical record that probably people did die as part of this riot, most likely the Chinese miners who, the really brief story is essentially that, the early Australian gold rush, there was white colonial miners, there was Chinese miners. The Chinese miners were very good at mining, and that didn't sit too well with some of the white miners, and there was a race riot as a result of who was getting better collections and who was working for less pay. And essentially there was a large riot. The police were called in, the Chinese were driven out of town. It formed some of the basis for the White Australia policy, which was a racist government policy which existed in Australia until well into the 20th century, and also was one of the reasons why the police force was formed, because they realised that they needed a more collective way to respond to civic unrest in New South Wales. So, although a very small town, it had this event which actually had really large implications for New South Wales and Australia in history. So, and as I said, this was something that the town knew happened somewhere around here, but no one knew exactly sure where it happened. The next thing I'll introduce is a really complex brief that this project had. So this is just a little bubble diagram which sort of maps out all the different kinds of spaces which we sort of worked out in that initial feasibility stage, which we worked on with the government, of what kind of spaces sort of joint this library has. And you can see highlighted in the red circle, there already was the idea of a Rotary learning space as part of the briefing stuff. But obviously we wanted to, not just focus on that one space, but work out how does the whole building talk to Indigenous cultural values, as well as creating a great Indigenous learning space in that Rotary space there. And go to the next slide. This slide really just put up just to give you a sense of, there was a lot of discussions that needed to happen with a lot of parties to try and get this project off the ground. It's like two layers of government, being local government running the council library, state government running the high school part of the library, and then all the community groups that had their own vested interest in a new community building being in Young. And so the main part of that was doing workshops, which I've highlighted in the centre here, and that's something I'm going to sort of focus on the next part of the presentation with the help of Michael to talk through how some of these workshops really formed relationships with people in Young and helped form the design, because it was clear that this project would be a project defined by dialogue and exchange, and whether it be the trust between the local community and the high school community, local government and state government, or us and the local First Nations community, it wouldn't progress unless everyone was in an open exchange and talking to each other. And the next slide sort of shows the starting point. I think Michael found these were comments on a news article which was about the library in the early stages, and there was a surprising public backlash in the town. And you would think that, offering to build a $20 million new library would excite people, but unfortunately there's a lot of people who, just want the library to stay as it was, or want the site to stay as it was because it might have been a sacred site, whatever happened, and a feeling that we shouldn't touch it because we might ruin it, even though people didn't really know what was there. So there was a starting point of negativity, which also needs to slowly be turned around over time. The first bit of workshopping, which we'll talk about, was really that workshopping with the First Nations community. This is one that occurred at Young High School with what we call an AECG group, which is an Aboriginal Consultation Education group. And most schools will have one of these, and it's about members of the Indigenous community having a say in what happens at a is one of these groups, which is the Local Aboriginal Lands Council. So this was, I think, a group with the AECG. We had multiple things like this. I might have back to Mark in the next minute.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity that it was just about facilitating this conversation and sort of weaving in how that could work with architecture or with an architectural context in mind. So it's about bringing elders to the table. There's Auntie Enid is the elder who was very prominent in the project, and then also about inviting the Aboriginal students from the school as well to have a say. So that was an important part of that process about the demographic. Using the building that would then inform how the design process could unfold. It was really great. We did a few of these workshops, and it was just about capturing that information in a really relaxed way. In Australia, that we use a term called yarning, and it's just this notion of just providing a level of comfort, in the space. That there's a loose framework about what the discussion is about, but as again, it's about relationship building and building of trust as well, and it's a sort of Indigenous methodology that can then really unpack about how comfortable community members feel in that space and interacting with this sort of pretty intensive and bureaucratic process of sort of designing a building in an education department setting as well. So the next slide, I'll just keep going, James. In terms of prior to these meetings, we went to this cultural centre, and it was in a nearby town named Condobolin, and this was a cultural centre. And again, it was just about being present in the space, meeting with local community there. As a project team, we sort of arrived into the space and were warmly welcomed, and there was a lot to take in about how the narratives of that particular place were incorporated into the design of the build of the actual centre. James, if you want to make a quick comment as well.
Yeah, I think that these early meetings and trips were really just about building a bit of a rapport, a bit of trust with people. I think that, as Michael said, in these processes, there's always the feeling that there's not enough time. I mean, there's always enough time. This project is 6 years in the end. But in the moment, you've always got a project manager or someone running the project telling you need to finish this phase of work in the next 2 weeks, you need to get this done. And I think that doesn't always fit in that well with these kind of processes. I think we did try and make as much time as we could in this one, and we did have many opportunities to meet, and that really didn't pay off. Because I would say, it's the second, it's the third, it's the fourth time that you talk to people that you probably really get somewhere. You can't expect it all to happen on day one, and I think if you do expect it all to happen on day one, you're going to be disappointed, and you're probably going to annoy some people too, because they think you're coming in trying to get something and leave straight away. I'll take that one here. So we did obviously other workshop and within complex project. The person in this project is a lady named Dr. Julie Ratkin, who is an education expert. So she was also brought in to try and make sense of this very complicated Chinese library. This is some workshopping we were doing with the high school. And Julie was also a really important person in this project because she was a local. We had a great relationship with Julia through other projects, but she lived in Arden. So although she had relationships with the high school and the council that she could leverage off, she also had relationships with local Indigenous community as well. So us knowing Julia and us knowing Michael, it really helped us form relationships with people in Young much quicker than we would have otherwise. So it was really fortunate that Julia was part of the project for us. The next slide shows the community consultations, which we did. This is more wider community, sort of town hall meetings with anyone who wants to show up. There was a lot of interest in where would the library go in the town. We were moving it off the main street up to the high school, which is mean, it's not that far, it's probably about 200 metres. That still meant a lot to some of the people who were used to, walking past the library every day when they walk down the main street. And the next slide is some of the workshopping we did with the students at the school, trying to work out, what does the library mean to them, and how can we make sure that they were part of this project. And then on the next slide, it's probably us a moment of reflection through all this early investigations and early workshopping about cultural values. And I think that, we've already talked about all the elements here, but then it was a matter of working out, well, what do we do with all these bits of information that we've learned? And I think it became clear to us that we had to try and enrich the brief as much as we could to try and make sure that culture was understood, discussed, and fostered as this building. As I mentioned, there was one room already in the brief, which is the Graduate Learning Centre of 70 square metres or whatever it was. But it became clear to us that the whole building had to do this, not just one room. The next one was, the building placement, form and evidence response had to be in dialogue with a whole bunch of things which I just mentioned, whether it be the colonial buildings which are surrounding it, whether it be the important Indigenous spaces which were already on site, or whether it be, the stories of this Chinese gold mining riot. And the third thing is, how do we use the library when this is all done to try and tell all these stories to people who come to young? Because although some of these things were kind of known by some of the community, there was a lot of people who had no idea that all this, rich culture existed up on this site. So they were sort of the three main challenges that we started setting for ourselves in this project. And I think Michael's next slide, we're going to start to talk about how we worked with Michael and the community to come up with some more tangible responses to these questions. And at the end, I'll kind of show you, where we ended up.
Thanks, James. Just for everyone, we're like halfway through the slides, so I think we're going to use up the full hour and a half. How this, we, coming together and talking about interactions and really understanding for me, this notion of what architecture is and then what country and community and culture means. And then you can have, think through different aspects of, a multitude of aspects that relate to each of them. But in the context of project work, it's about how these things interact and can be impactful. So if we start to do it diagrammatically, that's the sort of format where I've arrived at in this project, to say, things are interconnected, they're overlapping, there are things where you can actually find, relationships between. And that was, based on those workshops, to then sort of put forward ideas about how aspects of what was raised, could be presented, but then provide ideas about how they could potentially then be incorporated into the architecture. And I think the exercise was done, very early in the piece, very concurrently when the initial concepts were being developed by James and Kit. And it was a, opportunity to say, well, here's some ideas about what these things mean and how they could relate to architecture or the place making. And I think what was, what ended up happening was like just the nature of the conversations with James and Kit, sort of facilitating the dialogue from the workshops, was that there's this opportunity to use this, as a framework or a resource, but for then, as the project architects to really extend, other ideas that may be, that come up and resonate and then implemented in the design process. So it was a interesting process, and this is something that it's all about. I generating ideas, and then how they actually eventuate in the project. It's sort of like, if you've got a great idea, then, just go for it and test it out, and it'll work out. And I think it's a case of, in a more broader sense, there are very few, Indigenous architects in Australia, and it's this call out to, non-Indigenous architects and designers to say, here's an opportunity to, pay close attention, respectfully, create ideas and then implement those as part of the design. So, and there's an advocacy role in that as well. That's important in order for the growth of the network of Aboriginal architects in the Australian context, can continue to grow and become more empowered as well. So I'm going to hand it back to James. It might be a quick run through this second half, mindful of the time, James. And yeah, he'll just go through more of the concepts and then the finished building design.
Thanks, Michael. So here's a few diagrams, I guess, of how we started. So as I mentioned before, there was obviously this site exchange urban response from the site. We had these public buildings now facing the park. We were going to put another public building in the middle of that, the blue, which is where the library was going to go. So I guess the first thing that became apparent to us was we integrated a nice public access way along that southern edge of the park to give an address to the library, but also to give an address to these public buildings which lost it at some point over time. But in the next slide, it also became apparent very soon that we had to make that not just, sort of boulevard in, sort of the colonial tradition, but how do we use that public access way to start to link some of these places we already knew on site. As I mentioned, Reconciliation Tree, which was on site. We had the Indigenous Garden, which was already in the high school. We knew that we were creating a rotary learning space in our new building, which was going to be on that front corner. We knew we had some beautiful big blue pines, which had very strong historical meaning too. And then how do we create, a pathway in between all these things, which we could use as a divide, start telling stories, and start to shape and frame the building. The next slide then is sort of a dual narrative, but we also had, a colonial response that we really were forced into it in some ways, because this thing was a listed heritage item. And so then to go through all the government processes, you need to maintain the sightlines, maintain the setbacks to this existing heritage item. And now you can see sort of the stepping form starting to develop here, where we were sort of allowed to build from a colonial heritage response. And then the next slide, see how we're starting to wrap these two things together. So we have the spaces on site, we have the stepping filling form, and we have this idea of how to start to, articulate the building to create spaces on the inside and the outside, which sort of represent these spaces in between, which can start to become spaces for dialogue, interaction, reconciliation. And the next slide is the first sort of glimpse of the building, where you can really start to see the building starting to take on these linear forms, creating these spaces. And the next slide closes out that discussion about the colonial architecture that our building, does have some relationship to the seven forms, relationship to the setbacks. And the next slide you'll see that has also some references to the rhythm of the Greek temple, which is the colonial courthouse next door. The next slide starts to discuss this sort of the more joint use element of the project and how do you start to, diagram out a building which is really serving two different communities at the same time. We had the benefit of the site does change fundamental level in sections, so the park is about 1 story below the high school courtyard level. So it was an opportunity to have, a community entrance on the park side, a school entrance on the school side, and then have a celebratory stair in the middle which links the two communities together, but also mix some of the programs up and down to ensure that there's a strong element of movement through the building. And then also when you take that original diagram I showed you earlier of all the colours, you do start to diagram out bits that are more school and more community. And the next slide really gets into the detail of that you're going to end up with some spaces which are, fully school spaces during school hours. You're going to end up with spaces which are fully community spaces during community hours. And you're going to end up with some joint spaces. But then there's also the opportunity when outside of school hours, how do you start sharing those spaces, and outside of core library hours, how do you start sharing those spaces? So it ends up becoming quite complex, and that's kind of things that we're working through in these multiple workshops with the local young community and also the high school community too. The next slide just shows you where we ended up in terms of the community entrance, coming straight in, level access from the park. And I think that there was a lot of concern in the community that they wouldn't know where the library was, of the bits which got, sort of fully fleshed out and designed from the Gulf values, because there were some nice moments which ended up in the building. Just a quick look at the plan. Through all three plans of the buildings, community is the yellow, blue is the school, and orange is sort of the bits which are shared between two communities. And as you can see, top left of the image, you've got the entry for the community on ground. If you go to the next image, you can see that photo of that. And it'll be nice, big, open area entry. And the space at the back of this image, which has these large timber pivot doors, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, because that was designed, for a flexible space which could expand the area of the entry to have, events and openings, but also to be potentially a gallery space. And something that's really exciting, which is actually on in the library right now, is Auntie Enid Park, who Michael introduced before when he was talking about the workshop. Is also a local artist, and she currently is holding an exhibition there of some of her art. I think this is a great example of the idea of a gallery. We fought hard to keep it in the project, and now it's being used to show some beautiful local Indigenous art. And I think Ian's currently very, very pleased with the exhibition. So it's great to see people starting to use the library and the spaces for their intended purpose. The next image starts to show how the two floors of the building are connected together, and there's this double height space with a beautiful stair. And we really wanted to put a lot of emphasis on this stair, because for us it was more than just a stair, it was a symbol of how these two communities were being linked, and we had them both in the same building working very cooperatively together. But there wanted to also be some historical meaning behind the stair as well. And on the next slide, Michael earlier introduced Hayball Jackie and his interactions with James White, which was the first sort of white and First Nations interactions in Young. And Jackie was handed a bronze plate from James White to sort of honour their interaction and their sort of cultural relationship they had. And it came up quite early in the project that this bronze motif would really want to come through somewhere in the project to sort of remember this interaction. And that's why the stair ended up with the bronze colouring. And the next slide, we also have bronze detailing throughout the facade outside as well. This was something which was very welcome by the community to remember that interaction.
James, we're just getting a 5-minute call, so yeah, it's pretty tight.
Cool. Yeah, I can tell. Next one we can skip through. And the next one as well. These are just some photos down low. The next one is probably important though. So this is the Indigenous Learning Centre, which they wanted to have some dual naming on. So that's a word in the Rattray culture meaning to teach. So we're very happy with this space, which is basically the place where Rattray culture and language can be taught. And in the next slide, you can see Auntie Enid, one of her artworks, The Hills of Brungle, got printed onto a 4-metre wide rug, which is now sitting proudly in the Rattray learning space, and that's the spot where we'll sit on the ground and have a good yarn about culture. Next slide just shows some imagery of the upper ground floor. You can probably skip through the next couple of images, Michael, which are really just showing how that upper ground area has some spaces for community and school. And then the next one as well is just showing level 1. And this is really an art and multimedia floor where it's mostly for high school students, but the community also have their own dedicated storeroom, so they can also be doing their community art projects up there, and also use the top floor for a place for creating art as well. The next couple of slides are quite important though after these ones, Michael, so we'll skip to them. So while we were working on site, we had to do some investigations to make sure that we weren't digging up something we shouldn't in terms of the historical elements of the site. And we definitely did find the 12,000 artefacts were identified during the site excavations. They range and they really confirm all elements of the stories that have been told. So we found elements from the race riots, we found elements from the New South Wales Police Force, we found elements of the daily life of the Chinese and the early people of Young. And we also found a whole bunch of tools from, the which got to show all the more interesting items, and these pictures of some school students really delving into it and learning a lot about what was on this site before. And I think this is really important because sometimes you can think that heritage shouldn't be touched, that you shouldn't go there, but if we didn't do this project, no one would have known that the stuff was in the ground, and you wouldn't be able to tell these stories. So some of those early quotes that Michael found, we should just leave this site, I think it might be sacred. Well, we confirmed it definitely is sacred, and now we can tell the stories of what actually happened there. The next slide is one about language. So in the children's library, we got a Wiradjuri word wall going, so the kids can start to learn some simple words in local Wiradjuri languages, which apparently is a well-used part of the children's part of the library. And then the last couple of slides, I guess, goes back to where I started, but how do you start to link all these places together in a meaningful way in the landscape? And we had this idea of this, Wiradjuri walk or Wiradjuri timeline or something of that nature. And the next few slides show you how it ended up. So basically that Solnet's Park has a nice big access way on it. We've got this coloured concrete band which wraps from the street all the way back into the school, into the existing Indigenous garden. And in the concrete we've printed footprints for the local totem animals which were chosen by the local community groups. And then along the walkway we've got sculptures which show these animals walking along the pathway, and they're all heading towards the Wiradjuri Learning Centre. So they're all walking to one direction, which is the 5 feet outside the Wiradjuri Learning Space. And of course we have some information signage along that walk as well to start to tell the more detailed stories of what happened on the site. And then also, because it's about this dual narrative, the imprinting in the concrete as well, we do have a timeline of what happened in the Chinese history of the site with the riot, and to sort of remember what happened on this site from that perspective as well. And you can see at the end of the right there's some Indians walking towards the Wiradjuri Learning Space. So yeah, obviously that's just quick at the end, but that's a sort of a snapshot of all the bits that Michael helped us get into this project. I think the local community have really, in the past year, gotten around this project and started to really be proud of it as a beautiful building and a really meaningful one in Young. So, of course, thanks to Michael for helping me do that.
Thanks, James. I'm just going to wrap things up. But yeah, just to return it back to the theme, and, the imagination aspect of it. It's this really, what can we imagine? From where we come from, and the start of these projects to where it ends up, and then also how it will continue to live into the future. It's always this consideration, and how a place like this has a sense of belonging to this landscape, and how the stories of that landscape is present in it as well. It's a really exciting project. I've reconnected with the architect group, after a few years. I know them very well, and it's nice to really touch base again and be able to share it in this type of forum. The project is, won multiple awards at the regional architecture awards late last year, and it's currently in a process of another awards process right now. So it's an exciting one, and it's the innovation of this project, the shared use community and a high school, two realms, domains coming together and creating something. It's sort of very much not really seen that much in New South Wales. So to break down those sorts of elements of, what would be probably a risky proposition, for an education department in this instance, that it can really lead to something that's quite groundbreaking and innovative for the local communities. This is a link to a really great article that was written on the project. Encourage you to snap it and have a look. And we'll conclude the presentation. So thank you very much. Thanks, James, for joining us so early. Really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for hearing us.